Alright guys and girls, sorry I took a little break, that's why I split this video into two separate videos. Hope that's okay. So we're finishing up the chapter here called The Visitor, and looks like we just had a death here. So it was night when she woke, and opening her eyes she knew at once what had happened, and the bleak knowledge made her shut her eyes again. Maybe almost she wished that she were sick, too, that she could join him. For Nokomis had said that the Ojibwe must walk a path that leads out of this life into the next. And since Niwu couldn't walk very well yet, who would carry him when he got tired, when he fell? Who would make sure he was fed in the other world? Who would make him toy man dolls to dance? Who would care for him when he was lost? The answer, once she had risen, once she began working with Nokomis to care for her family, was a sad answer. Old Tallow brought the news later that day. She set 4 snared rabbits down near the door, then waited to speak. "Ten Snow is gone," she said, "and on the road to the next world surely she and Niwu would meet," thought Omakayas, tears blinding her as she tipped water to her father's lips. Surely Ten Snow would take hold of Niwu's hand, swing him up in her arms, and carry him along past the rough spots and danger to the place where they would be safe. Old Tallow took the horn spoon from Omakayas and ordered her to lie down to sleep. She made Nokomis lie down as well, in the corner with her grandchild. "You two rest now. Go on, or I'll take a stick to you." Her voice was fierce, rasping, angry, and strong. Nokomis obeyed her, sank into the skins, slept before her head touched the back of her blanket. Omakayas was glad to do the same. Old Tallow then proceeded to work. She built up the fire high to a greater heat than Nokomis had dared, for she knew she could chop more wood as needed. She brought a new kettle of water in, skinned her rabbits by the light of the fire, and boiled them for a nourishing soup. She cleaned every corner the way she never cleaned her own house. She left her dogs to run wild and tended every need. Cared for the humans she loved, and although she never would admit it, loved even more than she loved her dogs. Old Tallow's work helped them. But the next day she was left once more to hunt. Nokomis weakened, though she wasn't ill. Omakayas alone was left to tend to the sick ones. She had to keep the fire going, haul the water, cover them, bathe them down, comfort them when they were restless. She hardly slept an hour at a time. First one needed her, then the other, then a third, the first again. There was no stopping. Their cries were pitiful. When the terrible itching that gave the disease its name started, Omakayas wrapped their hands with cloth, bit down their fingernails, anything to keep them from scarring themselves. The itching nearly drove them from their minds. Pinch was the worst, and he'd weakened so badly that Nokomis was afraid for him. This disease, smallpox, leaves sores in your body all over, and like we mentioned, they itch terribly, and if you scratch at them, it can leave permanent scars, which we're going to find out is not going to be good news for Angeline. Night and day, one or the other sat with him, and did not let go of his hand for fear he would run to the land of the spirits. Even Andag seemed to sense how close Pinch was to death. Andag perched near Pinch, and though keeping guard, every time Pinch slumped too far away, the bird croaked, "Gago, Pinch!" One stubborn eye flared upon, and Pinch fixed his annoyed little boy glared upon the bird. He was mad, but he got well. "Gago, Pinch, Gago! Gago!" called Endig. What it really meant was, "Don't go, stay here." One night, Omachias woke to see Day trying to rise to his feet. In the dim light of a low fire, she saw him throw off his blankets. He tried to stagger outside. She knew that was certain death. Many died of this sickness when they became so fevered excuse me, that they lost their minds, threw off blankets, and walked outside to freeze. "Please, Day," she said, to draw him back. He sank onto all fours, but kept crawling determinedly towards the door, groaning, hair wild. His eyes did not know her, and his face was frightful. He clawed at the door, fell to his knees, got up on his knees. This time, he was so determined that Omachias knew there was no way she could save him from going outside. He was too strong for her, even in his sickness. "Gawin Anajida," she said. "I'm sorry." Raising a block of wood high, she brought it down on his head with all of her strength. He crumpled to the ground. Omachias sobbed as she dragged his blankets to him and covered him. He was too heavy to drag near the fire. For a long time she kneeled next to him, praying for him to live. She loved him, her Day. What would they do without him? Back in her own blankets, she immediately sank into fierce oblivion. When she woke, it was morning. Instantly, she remembered the night before. Was her father dead? Had her blow killed him? Fear gripped her as she crept to his side, put her hand to his lips. His breath came evenly. He seemed a little better, even than the day before. As the morning went on, he sipped broth for the first time. He opened his eyes. "My little frog," he smiled, closing his eyes again, this time to sleep comfortably. "You could bring down a bear with the strength in your club." His fever was broken at last. Omachias' constant attention brought the little family through the first part of the illness's danger. One by one they improved, all because of her careful nursing. Later it was the vaccine of the Reverend Hall, fetched from the mainland, that guarded the rest of the Ojibwe who had been exposed and who had survived the smallpox of 1847. 18 Ojibwe died of the disease, and one tried to kill himself by other means. That man was Fishtail. No one had understood it of him, but his wife was everything. When Ten Snow left him, Fishtail would not leave her body. He slashed his arms and was found in the blanket beside her, half alive. He survived, but once he had the strength, he cut off his long, thick, splendid hair. He buried it with the sweet woman who was called Ten Snow, not because her own skin was white, but because she had much of anything. She had much of anything to do with snow at all, but because the kind assurance of her nature had reminded her namers of the way the deep snow covers and forgives all it touches when it falls. In the deep of winter, Niwu and Ten Snow were buried side by side. A great bonfire was lighted in order to thaw the ground. Niwu and Ten Snow were wrapped in red blankets, then birch bark, and at last lay gently into their good mother, Akig, the earth. As soon as Day was better, he and Fishtail worked side by side, constructing the grave houses for their loved ones. At the western end of each little house, they carefully framed a small window-like opening, then built beneath it a shelf for spirit offerings. Although food was scarce, Mama often brought Niwu a little something saved from her own bowl and placed it on the shelf with tobacco. She stayed long in the cold, wrapped in her blanket, praying for her little boy. At the burying ground, there were many new graves. The winter was hard. As she sat talking to her child's spirit, someone else almost always came near, added their tobacco, said a few words of comfort, and passed on to their own grieving. Omakayas got sick too, but not with the smallpox. A wholly different fever followed on her family's recovery, an illness of weakness and grief. Even as her mother strengthened and her father got better and became more and more himself, Omakayas retreated from the world. She ate less and less, thought long into the night. Often in her mind's eye she saw Niwu's tiny moccasins, forlorn in the firelight as they sagged, tipped over when, in his fever, he kicked them off. He never wore them again in his short life. Her brother Pinch, however, more than recovered. From the loft, she could hear him downstairs, ruder and louder than ever. She heard her bird, Andeg scratching on the floor. She heard old Tallow come and go. She heard her grandmother singing an old song as she stirred something fragrant in the kettle. Gently, Mama called her from the base of the ladder. She heard this, but Omakayas kept her eyes closed. Food did not interest her. All she did was think of Niwu. She considered what she could have done to rest the illness. Fed him more soup, forced him to keep his moccasins warm on his feet, taken him out, away into the woods. Bear lived alone with him until the smallpox had run its course. And Mama, Omakayas worried about her too. She was so quiet and thin, so restrained. And when she sat, she didn't just sit still. It was like she turned to stone. In her eyes there was such a deep and penetrating look of loss that Omakayas could not bear to see her at all. Angeline was some comfort, though still weak. She kept badgering old Tallow to bring her a mirror. But the old woman refused until one day Angeline screamed at her. Shockingly, that she wanted to see herself. "Am I so bad looking?" she yelled in rage. "Am I so ugly now?" "Kaween," said old Tallow, very slowly, the lines in her face shadowing. "You are still beautiful." Omakayas, lying next to her sister, closed her eyes in pain. The smallpox had left Angeline's cheeks pitted with scars and slightly twisted Angeline's perfect hunting bow of a dark mouth. The smallpox had thinned her face until her teeth stuck out. The smallpox, worst of all, had killed Angeline's tiny brother and the friend of her heart, Tin Snow. Pain and loss showed in deep furrows around her sister's mouth. The mirror came, a scrap of it anyway, and Angeline stared into it. Slowly her eyes filled, and when she had seen enough, she put the mirror down gently, turned away, and refused for a long time to speak. It was difficult for Omakayas to understand all that had happened, why Niwu was gone, though at night she still imagined that she heard his cries, why her sister's face would never again be smooth, why she herself was still too weak to run and crept back to her sleeping blanket whenever she could. She slept and slept as though she would never wake. She didn't want to think about the things that had happened, but there were times that questions came to her, occurring in the deep of night, sometimes even in dreams. The spirits, the Manitous who lived in all things, why had they ignored her prayers and her mother's prayers and the powerful prayers of Nokomis? Why had Day-Day's strength not helped? And her grandmother's medicine, so useful at other times, why hadn't it worked for Niwu? Nakoma said sorrowfully that she had no medicines for this white man's disease, but Omakayas did not have smallpox. Omakayas had something else. Why didn't the strong tea made of bitter bark, the tea that Nokomis brewed for Omakayas, send her jumping up lively as she used to be? Sometimes she thought that if only her mother would laugh, she would begin to feel better. But Yellow Kettle was dull and angry with sorrow and couldn't help her own daughter. Day after day passed, and Nokomis's teas grew more bitter. She made a stronger concoction, burned sweetgrass braids, fanned Omakayas too, but the deep cold seemed to have seized her heart. She was ashamed of the way she thought sometimes up in her blanket. Listening to Pinch, her annoying brother, who didn't seem sad at all, she wondered why Niwu was taken and Pinch left behind. Why was Niwu taken to the next world and she left behind? There was no explanation that satisfied her. Nothing that gave her the hope she needed to rise and take up the rest of her life. Not even when Angeline bravely smashed a little piece of mirror one day and left the cabin, walking out the door, determined to go to the missionary school and learn the meaning of the white man's writing. Like Fishtail, not even when was Omakayas inspired to come downstairs. Nakoma sat with her, quilling through the whole day sometimes. She told her own old stories, adventures of Nanabozo, the tricky and generous teacher of the Anishinabeg, who cleverly outwitted dangerous foes and taught the Anishinabeg to survive. Omakayas listened, but she did not find in the stories the will to go forward. Could Nanabozo have outwitted smallpox? Could Nanabozo push back the dreadful day, send home the awful visitor who had taken Niwu and Tensnow? Could Nanabozo at least say a word or two in his own defense or encourage Omakayas to go on with her life? Nothing happened. No voices explained things. Her dreams were blank. One day, however, old Tallow unexpectedly appeared at the top of the ladder. In her rough, steady hand, she held a bark container of rabbit soup boiled up with potatoes from a storage cache. "Eat this," she urged Omakayas, "or else!" She threatened when Omakayas was reluctant. After Omakayas had taken the first taste, Tallow insisted that she drink it until she couldn't fit in another drop. "Ah, there," said Tallow approvingly. "You need to get your strength back." Omakayas nodded and closed her eyes. "Deep sleep now," said Tallow gruffly. "The sky is clear. Your brother is sliding in the lake. Go out. Be childish." Omakayas kept her eyes closed and lengthened her breath, hoping that old Tallow would believe that she had fallen asleep. After a while, the old woman fell silent, though she continued to sit near Omakayas, pondering what she should do next. Of course she was suspicious. Omakayas felt Tallow's gaze locked on her. After all, she was a hunter used to waiting at the dens of animals. If anyone could find a way to surprise Omakayas back to life, it would be her. Omakayas determined to outwait her, to crawl deeper and deeper into her dark burrow of sleep. Eventually, as though from far away, Omakayas felt the tentative brush of Tallow's tough, creased palm. She heard the rustle of her clothes as she got up and quietly left. At first, Omakayas tried to think she had won, that she had outwitted old Tallow, and made her impatient, as even the wariest animals often failed to do. But then the time stretched long, and Omakayas couldn't sleep. Her feet tangled to run. Energy from the rabbit soup flowed through her, and she drummed her fingers against the floor. She was stubborn. Shut her eyes. Who was fooling whom, she wondered. The sun was shining brilliantly outside. Had she really bested old Tallow? At whose expense? None other than her own. With a sigh, Omikias got up. She went out, and for the first time since the illness, she felt the sun in her face, but even its promise of warmth did not make her smile. So, what do you think about this chapter? What I'd like you to do is go ahead and write a journal entry. I want you to tell me, first of all, what you thought of this chapter, what happened in this chapter. What were the most important things, in your opinion, that happened in the chapter we just read, called The Visitor? What were the most important things, and how these things affected Omikias? Why didn't she get sick with smallpox? And how's the death of Niwu and Tin Snow going to affect her? So if you can write a journal response to those things, and then send me a picture of it, I'd appreciate it.